Okay, and welcome to Expected Inflation on NyQuil 2, Taylor Rule Boogaloo. Okay, so yeah, maybe you thought there wouldn't be music on this one because there wasn't last time or something like that, but haha, joke's on you. There's music on this one, just not on the last one because there wasn't music on the last one. Anyway, so let's talk about expected inflation a little bit more. So last time we talked about, well, expected inflation. And so we're going to talk more about expected inflation and how interest rate rules work with managing inflation, as well as how by managing inflation we can manage expected inflation. And we're going to be looking at this in both conventional monetary policy regimes, which is like what I talked about, where the Fed will buy short term treasury securities, but we're also going to look at some stuff with unconventional monetary policy regimes because we are currently in an unexpected, or not unexpected, geez, unconventional monetary policy regime. And, well, might be kind of useful to know exactly how that works. Um, we'll obviously go into further detail with this stuff a little bit later once we have a better understanding of monetary policy in the United States. But for the time being, I can at least give you, a little taste of what's going on here. So we're going to talk about something called the Taylor Rule, and we're going to talk about monetary policy regime changes and attempts to guide, well, the whole economy as well as expected inflation. And we're going to do this in the context of when inflation expectations are already low and we enter a recession. So this is now the second time in the last 13 or 14 years that the Fed funds rate has been between 0 and 0.25%, basically between 0 and 25 basis points. And we've been there since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We were also there around the middle to end of 2008, and we remained there until the end of 2015. So the fact that the Fed funds rate is extremely low right now is not like the first time it's ever happened. It's just the first time it's happened in the last decade. Actually, not even. Geez, if it was end of 2015. So yeah, it's the first time it's happened in the last 4.5 years. Now the Fed were, like I said, in a similar situation during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, with rates at the zero lower bound, or ZLB for short. These situations basically imply the Fed needs to use different policy tools if they're still going to have some kind of relevant effect on the business cycle, meaning if they're still going to be able to influence real economic activity. So what we're going to be doing with this Taylor rules, it's going to tell us where interest rates would be if the Fed were going to continue to use their conventional monetary policy tools only to engage in negative interest rates, right? Because really there's one of two things that can happen. The Fed can keep trying to affect short-term interest rates and expect them to go into negative interest rate territory, or they can do something else and go after longer-term interest rates, keep short-term rates at zero rather than let them go negative, and drive down the yield in sort of the long-term area rather than the short term. So they can do one of those two things. And as we'll see later on, the Federal Reserve opted to go for, option two, where they went after long-term Treasury securities rather than short-term Treasury securities. And they avoid negative interest rate territory at the expense of increasing excess reserves held by financial institutions. Now, to look at where things would be if the Fed engaged in negative interest rate policies, we're using something called the Taylor Rule, which is kind of like a rule of thumb that describes how the Fed funds rate would evolve given various weights on inflation and output deviations from their targets. So, for a little bit of history on the Taylor rule, it popped up during the economic debate about rules versus discretion. Under a rules based system, the Fed can't use stabilization policy, right? They'd be bound by a rule that they have to stick to, and that is that. Well, I guess technically they could use stabilization policy. If we made the Taylor rule a rule rather than a rule of thumb, right, there would be a very specific set of guidelines they would have to follow if they wanted to use stabilization policy. In other rules-based systems, the ones that are typically referred to like in the academic literature, there's something more along the lines of like you can only stabilize inflation, and we're going to remove that maximum employment part of your dual mandate. So now you have like a uni mandate. Under discretion, however, the Fed gets to do what they think is necessary a little bit more often, because certain types of policies will be useful when we are in, the upswing of a business cycle. When we're kind of in the downswing in a recession, there are other types of policies that will be useful. Now, for a little while, there really wasn't a whole lot of transparency regarding Fed policy when it came to setting interest rates, especially after the end of Bretton Woods, which is a sort of like type of gold standard that we were on up until the middle of the Nixon administration. I'm sure you've probably heard the phrase, Nixon took us off the gold standard. He kind of did and kind of didn't. We were already using a fiat currency before that. However, we were on the Bretton Woods system, which was a gold standard, but it was more in dealing with like international trade. It wasn't so much like, well, a dollar is worth, this amount of gold or something like that. It was a little different from that. So when the Taylor rule was formulated and published in 1993, kind of described Fed policy pretty well. It was kind of remarkable how well it described Fed policy, even like historically. But it also provides guidance for how monetary policy should be conducted, in the future, when there are inflation or output deviations from either inflation or output targets. And when inflation and output deviations are zero, the Taylor rule reduces to the Fisher equation. So let's kind of see what we're talking about here. The Taylor rule in its original form is this right here. So I've got a nominal interest rate being equal to the real interest rate, lowercase rt, plus the inflation rate, plus this alpha pi times this pi t minus pi t star. Pi t star is the target inflation rate, which in the United States is 2% per year. Alpha pi is the weight that the central bank places on deviations of inflation from their target, right? So it's how much the central bank cares about whether or not inflation is equal to its target. Now, YT is the log of real GDP. YT star is the log of potential real GDP. Now, when I say log here, it's sort of like an abusive notation. It's the natural logarithm of real GDP and the natural logarithm of potential real GDP. It's been my experience, economists are kind of bad about this stuff. We'll say log whatever when it kind of should be like ln whatever, because ln signifies the natural log, which is it's a logarithm just like any other logarithm, but it's base e rather than like base 10 or base whatever other you want this logarithm to be based by. So it's base e log, or a natural logarithm. And so we've got this alpha y being the weight that's placed on deviations of the natural log of output from the natural log of potential output, this yt minus yt star. Now, Taylor, in his 1993 paper, placed the original parameterizations for alpha pi and alpha y to be equal to each other at 1/2. So, as we can see, if we look at equation 1, when pi t and pi t star are equal to each other, and when yt and yt star are equal to each other, what's inside those parentheses goes to 0. And when it goes to 0, well, alpha pi times 0 is just 0, and alpha y times 0 is, again, 0. And the Taylor rule just collapses down to the Fisher equation. So really, it's kind of a modification of the Fisher equation in a sense, and not kind of, it is a modification of the Fisher equation in a sense, that provides sort of guidance or like a rule of thumb for how the central bank should be trying to maintain their monetary policy via shaping of interest rates. So from this Taylor rule, if inflation increases by 1 percentage point, then the Fed will raise nominal interest rates by more than 1 percentage point. Why is that? Well, if we look at this, right, if the change in the inflation rate is 1, meaning, 1 percentage point, well, we've got outside of the parentheses, there's that capital R equals lowercase r plus pi. Well, pi goes up by 1%. But then inside the parentheses, right, we also have pi going up by 1%. So what's going on inside those parentheses, especially if we consider just for a split second that, let's say the target inflation rate is 0. Well, if pi goes up by 1%, right, 1 minus 0 is 1. So what we get is that 1 for the inflation rate outside of those parentheses plus alpha times 1. And if alpha is larger than 0, then we're going to get 1 plus alpha times 1. Let's say alpha is 1/2, right? 1 plus 1/2 times 1 is just 1/2, so you get 1.5. So if the inflation rate increases by 1 percentage point, the nominal interest rate will be raised by more than 1 percentage point. This is what's known as the Taylor principle. And it's a fairly important little thing to discuss in monetary policy and macroeconomics in general, because it suggests that the Fed will actually take fairly drastic measures to keep inflation around its target, which in the United States is 2%. If the Fed can signal that they're aiming for an inflation rate within their target, inflation expectations have a better chance of being anchored around what the actual inflation rate is. And remember, it's good when actual inflation equals expected inflation because the price level is determined, right? We want price level determinacy. So, from the Taylor rule, we got this right here. These parameterizations, right? So basically what we set alpha pi and alpha y equal to can vary over time. They can change if, the Federal Open Market Committee is structured differently. Because alpha pi basically measures how much we care about inflation deviations. Alpha y measures how much we care about output deviations. Excuse me. So sometimes Fed chairs will care more about trying to stabilize inflation rather than control output. Other times they'll want to stabilize or control output more than they'll care about inflation. So, for example, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen were both fairly dovish on inflation. What do I mean by dovish on inflation? Well, if you're an inflation dove, you care more about trying to get output around its natural rate or its, potential GDP. You care more about that than you do trying to stabilize inflation because there's a trade-off, and the Taylor rule will show us what this trade-off is between inflation and output. If we care more about trying to get output to where it is, we're going to be a little dovish on inflation. But if we don't care so much about that, and we care a lot more about stabilizing inflation, then we become what's known as hawkish on inflation. So if you're a real stickler about keeping inflation near its target, you're what's known as an inflation hawk. If you're not much of a stickler about keeping inflation near its target, you're what's known as an inflation dove. But there are other things that can determine these parameterizations, aside from the makeup of the FOMC or who the Fed chairs are, like being at a certain point in the business cycle. If we're in a recession, well, if we're in a recession, chances are inflation's kind of low, and so is output. So what we're going to want to do is we are going to probably care a little bit more about trying to get output to where it is than we are inflation. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you have ever broken a bone. The best example I can think of right now is if you've ever heard of a show called The Expanse. It used to be on Sci-Fi, now it's on Amazon Prime. It is an absolutely phenomenal show. Highly recommend watching it. I love that show so much. But if you ever watch The Expanse, there is a scene in like the 5th episode of the first season where one of the guys, Amos, is hurt pretty badly, and he actually breaks his leg, and it's kind of gross. Trigger warning. He breaks his leg, and he gets a compound fracture, so his tibia is actually like sticking out of the skin, and they have to reset it. Now, I have never had a compound fracture. I have broken bones. I broke my tibia all the way through, but fortunately, it was still kind of set, so they didn't have to do anything with it. But I can only imagine the pain of having your leg broken so badly that the bone is sticking out of the skin. That's like, not only is the bone broken, but it's poking through your skin, so it's like, you get that cut. Ugh. Doesn't make me very happy to think about. Well, let's consider the bone stability of your leg like this YT minus YT star, right? So that's like the output thing. And, well, if someone's going to have to set that bone again, that's going to hurt really, really, really badly, like really badly. It's probably going to hurt so much that you might request some kind of a painkiller. Lord knows I would. I am not above that. And, well, they can't really give you anything like Advil because, like Advil, aspirin, Tylenol, those are all blood thinners. The last thing you want if you're already bleeding pretty badly is to put a blood thinner in. I would know that by experience because I had dental work done and I took a blood thinner, very stupidly, for trying to manage the pain, and I ended up bleeding all night. Wasn't any real danger or anything like that, but yeah, lost a good bit of blood. It wasn't very fun. So blood thinners are off the table. So that pretty much just leaves like opiate-based painkillers. So let's suppose you request a morphine drip. Well, that morphine drip, if you get it, it'll help reduce the pain. But opiates are, they're hilariously notorious, and I don't know why they're hilariously notorious. They're just extremely notorious for being very, very, very addictive drugs. Yeah, there's really nothing hilarious about an addiction. And so they're notorious for being addictive. Now, if your leg's broken and they have to reset the bone, that's gonna hurt. And probably no amount of morphine, at least, to an extent that won't lead to an overdose, will completely numb that pain. But a little bit of it might. So you go, all right, I can't kill all the pain, but I can kill a little bit of the pain if I take some morphine. Give me the morphine drip, set the bone. Well, if you take the morphine drip, you run the risk of getting addicted to morphine. But that's a little bit in the future, right? Probably, a couple weeks to a few months in the future before you really have to worry about, like, oh my God, have I built a dependence on this thing? So right now, your most pressing concern is getting your leg fixed. So you might opt to get the morphine drip so they can set the bone and you're not horribly screaming in pain. And you'll deal with the potential ramifications later of having, had this morphine drip. And you'll probably be on some kind of a painkiller for a little while, at least until the pain can kind of subside, the swelling gets down, skin heals, bone begins to heal, stuff like that. And so why did I go on that rant for a few minutes? Well, I went on that rant because that we can sort of think about that in terms of what's going on with inflation and output here, right? The output, if you're in a recession, you need to get output back to where it was. And you can probably care a little bit less about inflation right now because output needs to get back to where it was. That's like the more important thing of the two at that point in time. So you need to get that leg fixed. and you're probably going to be willing to run the risk of developing, maybe a mild dependency on some sort of an opiate-based painkiller. But you can deal with that later because right now the leg needs to get fixed. Same thing in a recession. Output needs to be back to where it was, and you're willing to accept inflation, like higher inflation, deviations in inflation from its target, in order to get output back to where it was. However, if we're not in a recession, maybe we can be a little bit more hawkish on inflation because output is probably really, really close to its potential. Especially if it's above its potential, yeah, we can be kind of hawkish on inflation. Now, what that would mean in the context of Amos breaking his leg is he didn't break his leg and he just wants to take a little bit of morphine anyways. Very, very, very different situation. Right? Even legally speaking, that's a very different situation because if you want to take a little bit of morphine when your leg's broken, well, a doctor's probably going to give you a prescription for it. If you're in the ER because your bone's sticking out of your skin, they're probably just going to skip the prescription and just hook you right up to an IV and let it drip in. But if your leg's not broken and you're not in any pain and you want to take a little morphine, you can take a little morphine. There's a catch. The state of, I guess you guys are in Tennessee. I'm in Georgia, but you guys are in Tennessee. And the state of Tennessee is probably going to want to make you a mandatory guest of the state for a little while. That's my guess. So if the economy is doing well, there's no need to be dovish on inflation. You don't want to be a little hawkish on it. So there's times at different points in the business cycle that you're going to want to use certain types of policy, interest rate policies, that will vary with these parameterizations or cause these parameterizations to vary. Right now, during his tenure, former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, all hail God King Ben Bernanke, claimed to follow a rule of monetary policy of alpha y being equal to 1 and alpha pi equal to 0.25. He cared a lot more about output, trying to get output back to where it was, than he did trying to get inflation to its target. And so what does that mean in terms of the nominal interest rate? It means that the nominal interest rate is going to be low. It's going to be consistently low for quite some time. He cared more about getting output back to potential GDP than he did about inflation increasing. Now, fortunately, this makes sense because inflation was pretty low during this period anyways. So since inflation was pretty low, it was already under its target, you didn't have to worry about that so much. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to plot out the Taylor rule. And I'm going to show what the federal funds rate would have been should we have been able to go into negative interest rate territory. So the Taylor rule that I'm using here is a little different. Now, this is formulated by Ben Bernanke himself in a Brookings Institute paper from a couple of years ago, where he talks about the parameterizations for alpha pi and alpha y that he followed during his tenure at the Federal Reserve. So the Taylor rule I'm using is really what Ben Bernanke mentioned during his talk. What I'm using here is I've got the federal funds rate on the left-hand side being equal to like the target Fed funds rate plus the inflation rate plus alpha pi times deviations of actual inflation from the target inflation plus alpha y times deviations in log GDP from log potential GDP. Now, it should be said here, there are three types of inflation, or three, measures of inflation that we have discussed thus far, and I want to make sure we don't get them confused. There is actual inflation, which is just pi t. So if you ever see pi t by itself, that is actual inflation. There is expected inflation, E of pi t. The expectations operator applied to inflation, because inflation is a random variable. So if you take the expectation of a random variable, you get the mean of that random variable. That's expected inflation. Finally, there is the inflation target. That's what they want inflation, actual inflation, to be at or around. So make sure you don't get those three confused. There's actual inflation, expected inflation, and the inflation target. The inflation target is usually going to have that notation of pi t with a little star, right? Meaning, like optimal target, something like that. I just wanted to make sure that that was addressed before we go a little bit further and actually come fairly close to wrapping up this lecture. So this RT star is a target Fed funds rate. We have core PCE inflation, Fed's target inflation rate, which is 2%, and consistent with what Bernanke does, I set alpha y at 1 and alpha pi at 0.25, just like Bernanke claims. Note, former FOMC chair Janet Yellen, who succeeded Ben Bernanke from, I believe, 2013 to 2017, who actually, cool little bit of monetary history of the United States, typically Fed chairs serve 2 terms. And there have been a lot of times where a Fed chair will be up for nomination, or I guess to be renominated for a second term under a different president than the president that nominated the original Fed chair, right? So, for example, Ben Bernanke was nominated by George W. Bush to be the FOMC chair. When his term was up and he was up for a second term, he was renominated by Barack Obama, who was a Democrat, not a Republican. Barack Obama nominated him for an additional term, and at the end of Bernanke's second term, Bernanke stepped down and he nominated Janet Yellen to be the FOMC chair. Now, Janet Yellen, she was up to be up for renomination or whatever in 2017 when President Donald J. Trump, as we all know, a Republican, was in office. Now, it's typical, regardless of the president who is in office, regardless of the party of the president and the party of the previous president who, nominated this Fed chair, it's generally accepted behavior to renominate that person, especially if they're doing a good job. And Janet Yellen, I believe, did a pretty good job. She really wasn't much worse than Ben Bernanke overall. Well, Donald Trump actually didn't nominate her for a second term, and that was the first time that had ever happened. If that had happened, Janet Yellen would still be Fed chair right now. And instead of selecting Janet Yellen for a second term, he nominated Fed Chair Jerome Powell, who I'm not quite as much of a fan. But yeah, just sort of interesting little side note there. However, Fed Chair Janet Yellen claims to have used this formulation as well. And as we will see, the data supports this claim. Now, the data that I plot this over is from 2003 up until the end of 2020. And when we look at this stuff, bear in mind that there were 4 different Fed chairs. There was Alan Greenspan at first, right, from 2003 up to, I believe, 2005 or 2006. Then there was Ben Bernanke up until 2013. There was Janet Yellen from 2013 to 2017. And then there was Jerome Powell from, I believe, the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, up until, now. So we've got 4 different Fed chairs. And it appears that at least 2 of these Fed chairs followed this Taylor rule formulation that you will see in this graph on the next slide, which is what we got right here. So let's see, up until about 2005, we can see that there's a fairly substantial deviation where the Fed funds rate, which is that blue curve, is vastly different than what the Taylor rule estimation for the Fed funds rate is. Around 2005, they converge and they kind of move with each other really up until the beginning of the recession the Great Recession, which started at the end, fourth quarter of 2007. They diverge a little bit. The Taylor rule kind of drops a little bit faster than the Fed funds rate does. And as we can see, the Fed funds rate just goes to the zero lower bound and it stops there. And the Taylor rule is showing us where the Fed funds rate would be had it not been constrained by the zero lower bound, had it actually been allowed to go below zero. And we can see that in that case, it actually drops to something like 7.5%. Other estimates put it down somewhere near like 6%. But either way, or negative 6%. But either way, it's negative. And as we can see throughout the course of some economic recovery, because remember the Taylor rule is a function of the target Fed funds rate, which, during the course of it being constrained by the zero lower bound was zero. The inflation rate and real GDP, and really deviations of real GDP from potential GDP. So as the economy is recovering, that could, very easily be signified by the fact that we had a recovery of real GDP. It's getting closer and closer to its potential. Now, we also had a very slow recovery, which when we talk more about the financial crisis, I'll go into a bit further. However, we had an extremely slow recovery of GDP as well as unemployment following the financial crisis. And it really wasn't until, I believe, 2016 or 2017 that we got back to our pre-financial crisis levels of both unemployment and real GDP. So, it's kind of a bit of a problem there. But anyways, we can see it's negative really up until around the time that the Fed funds rate begins to rise. We get to see economic activity pick back up, which I'll use the mouse and show you, around here, right? It really, really, really ramps up. And then we can see actually if Jerome Powell was following this Taylor rule. I don't think very highly of Jerome Powell. I don't think he thinks very often. So I will just go ahead and assume that he's probably not following any particularly different interest rate rule than what Bernanke and Yellen followed. It seems like he just kind of follows in their footsteps and just does what they did. And so we can see that the Fed funds rate comes up to like 2 to maybe 2.5%, something like that. However, the Taylor rule suggests it should be probably around 3%. Now, what's interesting about this is, and I know I keep going off on all these tangents, but it's interesting stuff, I hope. What's interesting about this is around the time that the Fed was beginning to try to unwind their balance sheet from quantitative easing, which you'll actually see in a couple of slides. They were trying to unwind their balance sheet. And if they were to unwind their balance sheet, basically they're engaging in a form of contractionary monetary policy, which means that there would be an increase in the federal funds rate. The Fed funds rate would hopefully go back to where it was prior to the Great Recession. However, that can possibly lead to economic downturns. And so the Fed was trying to time all of this just right, because if you raised rates too soon, recession. If you raise rates too late, massive amounts of inflation. We really don't want either. So they were being very careful in their timing, but they were allowing some of the long-term treasuries that they had on their balance sheet to expire, thus raising the federal funds rate. At the time, President Donald Trump was not a fan of that idea, and I'm sure you probably heard in the news Donald Trump wanted to fire the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, and he was looking into ways to being able to fire him. Funny enough for him, turns out he couldn't, haha. And so when he was pressuring him, this could actually possibly explain some of the deviations between the Taylor rule and the Fed funds rate. Now, there's other stuff as well that could be explaining that. Maybe Jerome Powell was using something different, since, we were in a different economic, time, because we were having pretty decent economic growth, actually very, very good economic growth. It really picked up around the time that Donald Trump came into office. Note, correlation does not imply causation. There's not enough evidence to say that Donald Trump did or did not play a hand in increasing economic growth. I want to say that right now. I'm not making a case for or against Donald Trump's presidency driving economic growth. But enough about that. It could be that they were following a different type of Taylor rule. However, I do find it interesting that, around the time that Donald Trump is talking about trying to fire Jerome Powell is where you start to see some of these deviations between the Taylor rule and the Fed funds rate. Just interesting to me. Means that, maybe the pressure he was exerting on Jerome Powell turned into pressure being exerted on the federal funds rate as well, because it wasn't as high as the Taylor rule suggests it should have been. But, oh, wow, okay, boom. Coronavirus pandemic hits. We go into a recession. Wow, look at this. That should be what, negative like 14 or 15% for what the Fed funds rate should be. However, again, Fed didn't want to go into negative interest rate policy. So this suggests what it should be if they were to go into negative interest rate territory. This suggests where it is. And we can see it drops precipitously, and then it begins to spike and then sort of slow down a little bit. Now, if we were to continue to plot this out, we'd probably see it going somewhere like, where this mouse is going right now. So it'll hand, eventually kind of creep back up. Because, okay, this is like, the height of the lockdowns. Everybody's really worried. Nobody really knew anything about COVID-19 yet. Everybody was locked down. Well, the economy is going to just basically come to a screeching halt. But then we see that, okay, the lockdowns kind of lift a little bit. Things start to get a little bit better. Now, not all the states have lifted their lockdowns yet, but, some have been like, okay, we'll lift the lockdowns, engage in social distancing, stuff like that. Obviously, it has way less of a detrimental effect on the economy than does just absolute lockdowns. But things still aren't really good economically speaking. Unemployment's still pretty high. We want to try to get that down. So, yeah, this sort of reflects like the economic conditions under the COVID-19 pandemic. So, yeah, just think that's kind of an interesting little thing there. Sort of puts a story to the graph, actually a couple of stories to the graph. Anyways, so we can see that when interest rates aren't bound below by zero, the Taylor rule fits the Fed funds rate pretty well. Going back, okay, here, there's a little bit of a deviation. But here, like, wow, look at that. That's pretty close. It's a nice tight fit there. Here, not quite so much, but here, definitely. That's kind of cool. So why did we care about this? Well, when the Fed manages interest rates via monetary policy, they can really only affect short-term rates when short-term rates are above the zero lower bound. But when interest rates need to go lower and the Fed just refuses to go below zero, like what we saw in 2008 and 2020, the Fed needs some other policy tools in order to be able to guide expectations about the future path of the economy, expectations about the future path of interest rates, expectations about the future path of inflation. Because if interest rates are this low, nothing's done about it, well, when we also have low inflation, like what we see here, right? So it's the same graph as what I had in the previous graph, except now I also added expected inflation. You can see we've got pretty low expected inflation. It's less than 2%. Not particularly great, is it? Nope. So when we have low expected inflation and low interest rates, then, well, that just makes it even harder for the Fed to use short-term interest rate like policy to try to guide the economy. So managing the Fed funds rate isn't going to be effective at the zero lower bound. And they have to go to other policy tools if they're going to guide inflation expectations and real economic activity. And this is where large-scale asset purchases, or quantitative easing, came into play. During quantitative easing, they opted to buy long-term bonds rather than short-term bonds. And in doing so, they substantially increased the money base. Now, remember, at the zero lower bound, right, if you looked at that, if you go back and look at the money supply, money demand graph, you can see that money demand eventually flattens out at a particularly low interest rate. That low interest rate where it flattens out is what's known as an effective lower bound. If the effective lower bound is equal to zero, then the effective lower bound is the zero lower bound. And at that lower bound, the demand for money becomes infinite. So what do you do when the demand for money becomes infinite? Well, you supply a lot of money. Now, So yeah, like we see this with the graph for the demand and supply of money. Money demand flattened out at that certain lower bound. But here's the thing, though. When the demand for money becomes infinite, you can't just print infinite money, right? That's a bad idea. It's a very bad idea. We'll actually talk about why that's a bad idea, because there are people that think we can do this, and it's a bad idea. So you don't just print infinite money. You just basically engage in larger scale open market operations. You buy a lot of long-term bonds, and that's what the Fed does in situations like this. So instead of buying short-term treasury securities to impact the short-term interest rate, they buy long-term treasury securities instead to affect longer-term interest rates. They flatten out the yield curve. Now, they flatten the yield curve because the yield curve is also what's known as, it evaded me when I made this first video earlier today, and it's evading me again. So here we go, term structure of interest rates, right? It's defined by the term structure of interest rates, and based on that, you can go after longer-term interest rates and flatten the yield curve, and that's what they were trying to do. So if short-term rates are already really low, you just go after long-term rates, so flatten the yield curve. In doing so, they purchase large amounts of these long-term treasury and mortgage-backed securities to make it happen. They massively expand their balance sheet by turning a lot of these long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities into excess reserves, right? Because they're not really just, quote, printing money and just throwing it out there. They're converting assets that already exist into liquid assets, right? So there's an illiquid asset that's converted into liquidity, cash, right? It's like if, you've got something you need to sell, like your car, right? It's like, boom, you just snap your fingers and the car turns into cash. That's what the Fed does. So when that happens, well, you've got a lot more cash on your hands. And when you have that much more cash on your hands, well, okay, cool, more liquidity. And so when they increase the money base by doing this, it ends up looking something like this. There were 3 rounds of quantitative easing. So these shaded areas represent these 3 rounds of quantitative easing. And you can see during each one, securities, this blue curve, right? These are securities held outright by the Fed. You can see that they increase pretty substantially during each round of quantitative easing. Now, this was about $4.2 trillion of securities. You can see it kind of begins to taper off. If this were to continue into 2020, what we would see is it would spike back up to, I think it's like $6 trillion of securities, basically one side of their balance sheet, right? And when securities increase, you can see that reserve balances are also increasing. Because as the Fed increases their holdings of securities, they are turning those securities into excess reserves for financial institutions. So as the securities are increasing, reserve balances for financial institutions are increasing. So you can see they're kind of moving together, right? They don't really move together at first, but then towards the end of QE1 and then the entry of QE2 and on, they kind of follow similar paths. So this is what the Fed's holding. Securities are what the Fed is holding. Reserve balances are what financial institutions are holding. And in doing so, they can use monetary policy to guide the expected future path of interest rates, which can then guide the expected future path of inflation. So even in a recession, the Fed can still use policy to guide the public's expectations about the path of the economy, which affects inflationary expectations. And the Federal Reserve is, again, engaging in similar behavior right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And they've increased their balance sheet, like I said, up to about $6 trillion. Might actually be higher right now. Now, this does bring up questions about the limits of this type of monetary expansion. However, I'm going to save that for another day because I want to get a little bit further into some other stuff before we can really talk about the limits of monetary expansion and what that would mean. So to wrap up on expected inflation, we talked about expected inflation. Yippee, yay for us. Talked about why it was important, what the Fed can do to anchor expectations of inflation, what happens if it's not anchored, how the Taylor rule works with managing interest rates, what happens when interest rates are constrained by the zero lower bound, And next, we're going to talk about Milton Friedman's suggested rule for setting the nominal interest rate to 0 to achieve the quote-unquote optimal quantity of money. Now, one thing I want to note is I've gotten a couple of questions about this. The optimal quantity of money is not 0. It's that the nominal interest rate is 0. When the nominal interest rate is set to 0, we achieve the optimal quantity of money. And at the optimal quantity of money, when the interest rate is 0, we get a real interest rate R, lowercase r, equal to the rate of deflation, which is negative pi. So you get R equals negative pi. But now that I have addressed that, have a great rest of your day, and be on the lookout for the next round of lectures going up. And I will also be posting a couple of YouTube videos for you guys to watch to give you a little bit more, context for monetary policy, how it works, all that fun stuff. So until then, enjoy, and I will see you next time. Actually, I guess I won't see you next time. I will see a computer that I will talk into, and you will see the screen that I have been talking at after I have talked at the screen. So we will have a COVID-free sharing of information. That's what we'll call it, COVID-free sharing of information. Anyways, enjoy.